The scorching Detroit sun beat down mercilessly on Rodriguez Auto Repair, casting long shadows across the oil-stained concrete floor. Matthew Nguyen wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his grease-covered hand, his dark skin glistening under the harsh fluorescent lights. At 28, he had spent the last decade proving himself in a world that constantly questioned his abilities. "Yo, Matt," called out Tony Rodriguez, the shop owner, his voice echoing through the cluttered garage. "Mrs. Patterson's Honda is making that grinding noise again. Think you can work your magic?" Matthew nodded silently, already mentally diagnosing the problem. Around him, his co-workers, mostly older white men with decades of experience, barely acknowledged his presence. They saw him as the quiet kid who was good with his hands, but nothing more. They had no idea that Matthew could rebuild an engine blindfolded or diagnose complex electrical systems that stumped even the most seasoned mechanics. The familiar rumble of an expensive engine suddenly filled the garage, causing every head to turn. Through the open bay doors, a sleek black Bentley glided into the parking lot, its chrome gleaming like liquid mercury. Matthew's breath caught in his throat. He had never seen such luxury this close. The driver's door opened, and out stepped Emma White, a woman in her early 50s with perfectly styled platinum blonde hair and a designer suit that probably cost more than Matthew made in 6 months. Her ice-blue eyes surveyed the garage with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to getting exactly what she wanted. "Which one of you is the owner?" Her voice cut through the sudden silence like a blade. Tony stepped forward, wiping his hands nervously on his coveralls. "That's me, Ma'am, Tony Rodriguez. How can we help you?" Emma's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I have a problem that your hair establishment might be able to solve." The garage door of a massive car carrier truck began to rise with a mechanical whir. Matthew's jaw dropped as a pristine 1967 Ferrari 275 GTB was carefully unloaded. The car was breathtaking. Rosso Corsa red paint gleaming like fresh blood, chrome bumpers reflecting the afternoon sun, and curves that seemed to flow like liquid art. "This," Emma announced dramatically, gesturing toward the Ferrari, "has been to 17 different specialists, the best mechanics in Chicago, New York, even flew experts in from Italy." Her voice grew sharper with each word. "None of them could fix it. The engine makes a sound that shouldn't exist, and it dies randomly. It's been 6 months of failure after failure." Behind Emma, a young woman emerged from the Bentley. Sophie White was 26, with shoulder-length auburn hair and intelligent green eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She wore a simple blue dress and flats, clearly uncomfortable with the attention her mother was drawing. "Mom, please," Sophie whispered, her cheeks flushing pink with embarrassment. "Can we just ask them normally?" Emma waved her daughter off dismissively. "Nonsense, darling. These situations require motivation." She turned back to the assembled mechanics, her voice rising theatrically. "Here's my offer, gentlemen, whichever one of you can fix my Ferrari." She paused for dramatic effect, her eyes gleaming with mischief. "Gets to marry my daughter." The garage erupted in uncomfortable laughter. Tony chuckled nervously, shaking his head. "Ma'am, I think you might be joking, but we don't really—" "Do I look like I joke about business?" Emma's voice cut through the laughter like a whip crack. Sophie's face went crimson. "Mother, you cannot be serious." "Oh, but I am, sweetheart, completely serious." Matthew watched the scene unfold, his heart pounding, while the other mechanics continued laughing and making jokes under their breath. He found himself studying the Ferrari with growing fascination. Something about the challenge called to him, not the ridiculous marriage proposition, but the puzzle of what could stump so many experts. "Ma'am," old Pete Wilson called out, still chuckling. "With all due respect, that's crazy talk. We work on regular cars here, not million-dollar museum pieces." "Yeah," agreed Jake Morrison, another veteran mechanic. "Why don't you take it to one of those fancy dealerships?" Emma's smile turned predatory. "Because the fancy dealerships failed, every single one." Matthew stepped forward, his voice quiet but clear. "I'll take a look at it." The garage fell silent. Every pair of eyes turned to stare at him in disbelief. "What did you say, kid?" Tony asked, certain he had misheard. "I said I'll take a look at your Ferrari." "Ma'am?" Matthew's voice grew stronger, more confident. 20 minutes, that's all I need to tell you what's wrong with it." Emma's eyebrows rose in surprise. She had expected more jokes, more dismissals. She hadn't expected this quiet young man with calloused hands and determined eyes to step forward when no one else would. 20 minutes, she repeated, studying Matthew's face intently. 20 minutes to diagnose it. If I can't tell you exactly what's wrong, you don't owe me anything. Sophie found herself staring at Matthew, intrigued despite herself, while everyone else had laughed at her mother's outrageous proposition. He had looked at the Ferrari with the focused intensity of someone who genuinely cared about solving the puzzle. "And if you can," Emma asked, her voice suddenly serious. Matthew met her gaze steadily. "Then you'll know your car can be fixed." For a moment the garage was so quiet you could hear the distant traffic on 8 Mile Road. Then Emma clapped her hands together sharply, the sound echoing like a gunshot. 20 minutes it is, young man. But understand this, 17 of the best mechanics in the country have tried and failed. What makes you think you can succeed where they couldn't?" Matthew was already walking toward the Ferrari, his eyes drinking in every detail of the legendary machine. "Because," he said without turning around, "sometimes the answer isn't in what everyone else sees. Sometimes it's in what they don't." As he approached the car, Matthew felt the weight of every stare in the garage, his co-workers' skeptical whispers, Emma's calculating gaze, and Sophie's curious attention. But all of that faded away as he opened the Ferrari's hood and saw the magnificent V12 engine nestled within. The 20 minutes that would change everything had just begun. Matthew's hands trembled slightly as he lifted the Ferrari's hood, revealing the heart of Italian engineering excellence. The V12 engine sat before him like a sleeping giant. 12 cylinders, arranged in perfect symmetry, each component crafted with the precision that only Ferrari could achieve. For a moment, he simply stood there, absorbing the beauty of the machine. "Clock's ticking, kid," Jake Morrison called out mockingly from across the garage. 17 minutes left to perform your miracle." Matthew ignored the jeer. His mind already shifting into a different gear, he pulled out his small LED flashlight and began his examination, starting with what others would consider the obvious. The spark plugs, fuel lines, electrical connections. Everything appeared pristine, exactly as he expected, from a car that had been serviced by the world's best. "What exactly does the engine do when it fails?" Matthew asked Emma. His voice focused and professional. Emma looked surprised that he was actually taking this seriously. "It makes a sound, like metal grinding against metal, but deeper, almost like a growl. Then it just dies. Completely, won't restart for hours." "How often does it happen?" "Randomly, sometimes after 5 minutes of driving, sometimes after an hour. There's no pattern that anyone can identify." Matthew nodded. Continuing his inspection, he checked the timing belt, the distributor, the fuel injection system. All perfect, 15 minutes left. Sophie found herself moving closer, genuinely curious about Matthew's methodical approach. Unlike the other mechanics who had dismissed the challenge outright, he moved with quiet confidence, his hands gentle but sure as they explored the engine's components. "Mum," Sophie whispered, "maybe we should let him work without the pressure of that ridiculous bet." Emma waved her off. "Nonsense, darling. Pressure reveals character. Besides, he accepted the terms." Matthew heard the whispered conversation, but didn't let it distract him. He was beginning to understand why so many experts had failed. They had looked at all the obvious problems, the common failure points that plagued most engines. But this wasn't most engines. This was a 1967 Ferrari, built in an era when craftsmanship trumped mass production. 12 minutes left. Matthew lay down on the creeper and slid under the car, his flashlight illuminating the undercarriage. The exhaust system gleamed, recently serviced. The transmission looked solid, but then his light caught something, a shadow that didn't belong. "Mrs. White," he called out from under the car. "Has anyone checked the harmonic balancer?" "The what?" Emma's voice carried a note of confusion. Matthew slid out from under the Ferrari, his coveralls now decorated with fresh oil stains. "The harmonic balancer. It's attached to the crankshaft, designed to reduce vibrations in the engine on a car this old, especially one that's been sitting for extended periods." He moved to the front of the engine, using his fingers to feel rather than just look there. A subtle looseness in the massive pulley wheel attached to the crankshaft. It was so slight that visual inspection alone would miss it, but Matthew's experienced hands detected the microscopic play that shouldn't exist. "Son of a—" Tony Rodriguez moved closer, genuinely intrigued now. "You think that's it?" "I think," Matthew said carefully, "that this harmonic balancer has been slowly working itself loose. When it reaches a critical point of looseness, it creates that grinding sound Mrs. White described, metal on metal but deeper than surface contact. The vibration it creates eventually disrupts the entire engine timing, causing it to shut down. 8 minutes left." "But why would it restart later?" Sophie asked, her engineering background making her curious about the technical details. Matthew looked at her directly for the first time, noting the intelligence in her green eyes. Because as the engine cools down, the metal contracts slightly, temporarily tightening the balancer just enough to restore proper function, until it warms up again, and the cycle repeats. Emma's expression had shifted from skeptical amusement to serious attention, and none of the other mechanics thought to check this. It's not a common failure point, Matthew admitted honestly. Most modern engines have better designed balancers, but on a '67 Ferrari, especially one that's had restoration work done, he gestured toward the engine, someone probably over-torqued it during reassembly, weakening the metal over time. 5 minutes left. Can you prove it? Emma's voice was sharp now. Businesslike, Matthew nodded. Give me permission to remove the balancer and I'll show you exactly what's wrong, but fair warning. If I'm right, you'll need to order a replacement part from Italy. This isn't something we can jury-rig. The garage had fallen completely silent. Even the veterans like Pete Wilson and Jake Morrison had stopped their skeptical muttering, watching Matthew work with growing respect. This wasn't the quiet kid who usually handled oil changes and brake jobs. This was a master craftsman, diagnosing a problem that had stumped the best in the business. Do it, Emma said firmly. Matthew grabbed his tools and went to work. With practiced efficiency, he loosened the bolt holding the harmonic balancer in place. As he removed it, the massive steel disc came free with a grinding sound that made everyone wince. There, Matthew said. Holding up the balancer for everyone to see, the inner surface was scored with deep grooves, and the center bore was visibly enlarged. The bolt hole has been wallowed out every time the engine runs. This thing wobbles, creating vibration that eventually cascades through the entire timing system. 2 minutes left. Emma took the damaged part in her manicured hands, her expression stunned. 17 mechanics, 17, and none of them found this. They probably didn't think to look, Matthew said simply. It's an unusual failure for this type of engine. Most would focus on fuel delivery. Ignition timing, compression issues, the common culprits. Sophie was staring at Matthew with undisguised admiration. That's brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. 1 minute left. Tony Rodriguez shook his head in amazement. Matt, I've seen you work for 8 years, but this is next level, son. Matthew set his tools down carefully, his heart pounding with a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. 19 minutes and 30 seconds, he announced quietly. The silence stretched for a long moment, broken only by the distant sound of traffic and the hum of the garage's ventilation system. Then Emma began to laugh, not the mocking laughter from earlier, but genuine surprised delight. 19 minutes and 30 seconds, she repeated, her voice filled with wonder, to solve a problem that stumped 17 specialists over 6 months. She looked around the garage at the assembled mechanics, then back at Matthew. Gentlemen, it appears we have a winner. Sophie's face had gone pale, the reality of her mother's outrageous bet suddenly hitting home. Mom, you can't be serious about the marriage thing. That was just dramatic flair, right? Emma's smile was enigmatic. Oh, my dear Sophie, I never make promises I don't intend to keep. Matthew felt the weight of every stare in the garage, but his attention was focused on Sophie's stricken expression. Whatever happened next, those 20 minutes had just changed all of their lives forever. The silence that followed Emma's declaration stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap at any moment. Matthew stood frozen beside the Ferrari, the damaged harmonic balancer still in his oil-stained hands, suddenly realizing the magnitude of what had just transpired. Sophie's face had drained of all color. Mother, you cannot possibly be serious about this ridiculous arrangement. Language, darling, Emma replied coolly, smoothing an imaginary wrinkle from her designer suit. And I am completely serious. A white always honors their word. But this is insane. Sophie's voice cracked with a mixture of anger and disbelief. You can't just auction me off like some medieval princess. This is the 21st century. Matthew finally found his voice. Ma'am, Mrs. White, I never agreed to any marriage. I just wanted to fix your car. Emma's sharp blue eyes fixed on him with laser-like intensity. So you accepted the challenge, young man? The terms were clearly stated in front of witnesses. She gestured around the garage, where every mechanic stood transfixed by the unfolding drama. Tony Rodriguez stepped forward nervously, his hands raised in a peacekeeping gesture. Now wait just a minute here. This was all just talk, right? Nobody's seriously considering... I am completely serious. Emma cut him off. This young man... She paused, realizing she didn't even know his name. Matthew, he supplied quietly. Matthew Nguyen. Matthew Nguyen has accomplished in 20 minutes what millions of dollars and months of expert consultation could not. That level of skill, dedication, and intelligence deserves recognition. Jake Morrison let out a nervous laugh. Lady, you're talking crazy. You can't force people to get married because someone fixed your car. Emma's expression turned icy. I'm not forcing anyone. I'm offering an opportunity. Matthew proved himself worthy of consideration for my daughter's hand. The decision of whether to pursue that opportunity is entirely up to both of them. Sophie whirled to face Matthew, her green eyes blazing. And I suppose you're going to go along with this medieval nonsense, claim your prize like some conquering hero. Matthew felt heat rise in his cheeks. I don't want a prize. I don't even know you. This whole thing is... He searched for the right word. It's crazy. Exactly. Sophie threw her hands up in exasperation. Finally, someone with sense. But Emma wasn't finished. However, she continued, her voice taking on the tone of a seasoned negotiator, I am willing to make this arrangement beneficial for everyone involved. She began pacing slowly around the Ferrari, her heels clicking on the concrete floor like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. Matthew, what do you make here annually? Matthew shifted uncomfortably. That's personal. 40,000, 50. Emma's voice was matter-of-fact. I'm guessing closer to 40, given the location and the nature of the work. Tony looked embarrassed. Ma'am, we pay fair wages for... I'm sure you do. Emma waved him off. Matthew, I'm prepared to offer you a position as head of automotive restoration for White Industries, starting salary, $150,000 annually, plus benefits and a company car. The garage erupted in whispers and shocked exclamations. Matthew felt his knees go weak. That was nearly 4 times what he currently made. There's just one condition, Emma continued smoothly. You spend the next 3 months getting to know my daughter. Properly chaperoned, of course, dinners, cultural events, opportunities to discover if you're truly compatible. Sophie's mouth fell open. So you're bribing him to date me. I'm creating an opportunity for both of you to discover what you might have missed otherwise. Emma replied calmly. Matthew is clearly brilliant, hard-working, and honest. You, my dear, are intelligent, accomplished, and have been stubbornly single for 3 years, despite my efforts to introduce you to suitable young men. Suitable, according to you, Sophie shot back. Rich, boring, and completely lacking in personality. Matthew found himself studying Sophie more carefully. As mother and daughter argued, she was beautiful, certainly, but more than that. There was fire in her eyes, intelligence in the way she articulated her frustration. She wasn't some pampered princess. She was fighting for her own agency, her right to make her own choices. What if I say no? Matthew asked quietly. Emma paused in her pacing. Then you return to your current life, having gained the satisfaction of solving an impossible puzzle. No harm, no foul. And if I say yes to the job, but no to the dating arrangement, the job offer stands regardless, Emma said, surprising everyone. I don't make business decisions based on personal disappointments. You've proven your worth professionally. Sophie stared at her mother in shock. You're serious about the job offer, even without the dating condition. Completely serious. White Industries has been looking for someone to head our classic car restoration division. We have clients with Ferraris, Lamborghinis, Aston Martins, all requiring the kind of expertise Matthew just demonstrated. Matthew felt the world spinning around him. An hour ago, he had been just another mechanic in a struggling Detroit garage. Now he was being offered a dream job and, what? A chance at something he had never imagined possible. I need time to think, he said finally. Of course, Emma nodded approvingly. Intelligent people don't make life-changing decisions in parking lots. You have until tomorrow evening to decide. She pulled a business card from her purse and handed it to Matthew. The card was heavy, expensive paper with embossed lettering. Emma White, CEO, White Industries. My personal number is on the back. Call me with your decision. Sophie grabbed her mother's arm. And what about my decision? Don't I get a say in this arrangement? Emma's expression softened slightly as she looked at her daughter. Of course, darling. You always have a choice, but I'm asking you to consider giving Matthew a chance. One dinner, if there's nothing there, no chemistry, no connection, then that's the end of it. One dinner, Sophie repeated skeptically. One dinner, Emma confirmed, with the understanding that if either of you decides there's no potential, the arrangement ends with no hard feelings. Matthew looked at Sophie, really looked at her for the first time. Behind the anger and embarrassment, he saw something else. Curiosity. She was intrigued despite herself. What do you think? He asked her directly. Sophie bit her lower lip, clearly torn. I think this is the most ridiculous situation I've ever been in, she said finally. But, she paused, seeming to gather her courage. But you did just solve a problem that stumped 17 experts. That's impressive. So is standing up to your mother when she's being completely unreasonable, Matthew replied with a small smile. For the first time since the whole drama began, Sophie smiled back. You have no idea how unreasonable she can be. I'm getting a pretty good picture. Emma clapped her hands together, clearly pleased with this development. Excellent. Then it's settled, Matthew. You have until tomorrow evening to decide about the job, Sophie, darling. You have the same deadline to decide about dinner. As the white women prepared to leave, Sophie turned back to Matthew. For what it's worth, what you did today was genuinely brilliant. Whatever you decide about the rest of it, you should be proud of that. Thank you, Matthew said, meaning it. As the Bentley pulled away, taking the Ferrari and its bizarre challenge with it, Matthew found himself surrounded by his co-workers, all of them looking at him like he had just sprouted wings. Dude, Tony said, shaking his head in amazement, your life just got very, very complicated. Matthew looked down at the business card in his hand, then up at the spot where Sophie had been standing just moments before. Yeah, he said quietly. It really did. Matthew sat on the fire escape outside his cramped studio apartment, Emma's business card balanced between his fingers as the Detroit skyline glittered in the distance. 24 hours had passed since the most surreal day of his life, and he still couldn't quite believe it had actually happened. His phone had been buzzing constantly with calls from his co-workers, each one wanting to know what he was going to do. Tony had called 3 times, oscillating between excitement for Matthew's opportunity and panic about losing his best mechanic. Even his mother had somehow heard about it through the neighborhood grapevine and called from Mississippi. Her voice a mixture of pride and concern. Baby, this sounds too good to be true, she had said during their hour-long conversation. You know what they say about things that sound too good to be true. But Matthew couldn't shake the memory of those 20 minutes under the Ferrari's hood. The pure joy of diagnosing something that had stumped everyone else. The satisfaction of being right. And then there was Sophie's smile at the end, genuine and warm despite the bizarre circumstances. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from an unknown number. This is Sophie. Got your number from Tony at the garage. Can we talk? Matthew stared at the message, his heart rate quickening. Before he could overthink it, he typed back, Sure. When and where? The response came quickly. Belle Isle Park near the fountain, 7 p.m. I promise my mother won't be hiding in the bushes. Despite everything, Matthew found himself smiling at her humor. See you there. Belle Isle Park was nearly empty as the sun began to set over the Detroit River. Matthew found Sophie sitting on a bench near the James Scott Memorial Fountain, her auburn hair catching the golden light. She had traded yesterday's dress for jeans and a simple green sweater that brought out her eyes. For you came, she said as he approached, sounding genuinely surprised. You asked, Matthew replied, settling onto the bench beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the fountain's water dance in the evening light. Finally, Sophie spoke. I've been thinking about yesterday, about what my mother did. I want you to know that I'm mortified, completely mortified. She turned to face him. But I'm also curious about something. What's that? Why did you step forward when everyone else was laughing and dismissing the whole thing? Why did you accept the challenge? Matthew considered the question carefully. Honestly, it wasn't about the marriage thing at all. That part seemed like a joke, but the car... He paused, searching for the right words. I've been working on engines since I was 12 years old. My grandfather had an old Mustang that was always breaking down, and he taught me that every mechanical problem has a logical solution. You just have to be patient enough to find it. And when you saw the Ferrari, I saw a puzzle that 17 people couldn't solve. That's irresistible to me. I had to know what they missed. Sophie nodded slowly. That makes sense. More sense than my mother's medieval matchmaking scheme. She let out a frustrated laugh. Do you know what she told me this morning? I'm afraid to ask. She said, and I quote, Sophie, darling, you've been so focused on finding someone who matches your intellectual qualifications that you've completely ignored the possibility of finding someone who exceeds them. Sophie's imitation of her mother's refined accent was spot on. Matthew felt heat creep up his neck. She said, I exceed your intellectual qualifications. Apparently solving her impossible car problem in 20 minutes impressed her more than 3 years of Harvard MBAs and Wall Street analysts trying to win my attention at charity galas. Harvard MBAs? Huh? Matthew's voice was carefully neutral. Sounds like tough competition. Sophie laughed, but there was no humor in it. They're not competition, Matthew. They're my mother's idea of suitable suitors. Men who see me as a trophy wife who comes with a trust fund and business connections. She turned to look at him directly. You didn't even know who we were yesterday, did you? Should I have? White Industries is worth about $200 million. We're in manufacturing, primarily automotive parts, but we've diversified into luxury goods and restoration services. Sophie's voice was matter-of-fact. Most men I meet either know exactly who I am before they introduce themselves, or they find out quickly and suddenly become very interested in my conversation. Matthew whistled low. 200 million, that's a lot of zeros. It is, and it makes it very difficult to know if someone likes you, or for what you represent. They fell silent again, both lost in thought. A jogger passed by, earbuds in, completely absorbed in her evening run. In the distance, a freighter moved slowly down the Detroit River toward Lake Huron. Can I ask you something? Matthew said finally. Sure. What do you want? Not what your mother wants, not what society expects. What do you actually want? Sophie was quiet for so long that Matthew began to wonder if he had overstepped. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost vulnerable. I want someone who sees me as Sophie first, and the White Industries heiress second. Someone who challenges me intellectually, who doesn't feel threatened by my engineering degree or my opinions about business. She paused. And I want someone who's passionate about something, the way you were passionate about figuring out that engine problem, that kind of intensity, purpose. Those don't seem like unreasonable things to want. You'd be surprised how rare they are in my social circle. Sophie turned to study his profile. What about you? What do you want? Matthew thought about it seriously. I want to be recognized for what I can do, not dismissed because of where I come from or what I look like. I want to work on cars that matter, puzzles that challenge me, and he hesitated. And I want someone who doesn't see my calloused hands as something to be ashamed of, someone who understands that working with your hands, creating something or fixing something, is just as valuable as pushing papers in an office. Sophie looked down at his hands, scarred and stained from years of honest work. Without thinking, she reached out and traced a particularly prominent scar along his knuckle. How did you get this one? Slipped wrench when I was 16, 62 Chevy Impala with a stubborn carburetor. Matthew's voice was quiet, distracted by the gentle touch of her finger on his skin. And this one, she traced another scar on his palm. Broken glass, customer brought in a car with a shattered headlight. Didn't mention that the pieces were still loose inside the housing. Sophie smiled. Each scar tells a story. Yeah, my mother always said they were proof of an honest day's work. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She is. She's also going to have a heart attack when I tell her I'm considering taking a job that pays more than she makes in 3 years. Sophie's hand was still resting on his, warm and soft against his calloused palm. So you are considering it, the job offer. It's hard not to. It's everything I've ever wanted professionally. The chance to work on incredible cars, to be respected for my skills rather than tolerated. Matthew looked at her directly. But I'd be lying if I said the job was the only thing I was considering. Matthew, I know this is crazy. I know we just met under the most bizarre circumstances imaginable, but there's something here. Isn't there something worth exploring? Sophie's cheeks flushed pink in the fading light. I think so, God help me, I think so. So what do we do about it? Sophie was quiet for a long moment, her thumb unconsciously stroking across his knuckles as she thought, we ignore my mother's ridiculous timeline and her dramatic declarations. We forget about the marriage talk and the arranged courtship nonsense. Matthew's heart sank slightly. Okay, and instead, Sophie continued, a small smile playing at her lips, we do this the normal way. We go on a real date, one where you ask me because you want to spend time with me, not because my mother bribed you into it. Matthew felt hope bloom in his chest. Sophie White, would you like to have dinner with me tomorrow night? Yes, Matthew Nguyen, I would like that very much. As they sat there in the growing darkness, hands intertwined on the bench between them, both of them felt the same thing, that sometimes the most extraordinary things begin with the courage to say yes to something uncertain. Tomorrow, Matthew would call Emma White and accept her job offer. Tomorrow, he would start a new chapter of his life. But tonight, he was just a man who had found something he hadn't even known he was looking for. Chapter 5. The First Date. Matthew stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie for the 5th time in 10 minutes. He had spent his entire paycheck on a new navy suit, crisp white shirt, and leather shoes that didn't have oil stains on them. His reflection looked back at him, nervous, excited and completely out of his element. His phone buzzed with a text from Sophie. "I hope you don't mind, but I made reservations somewhere casual. I want to actually be able to hear you talk." "Sir." Relief flooded through him. He'd been dreading some ultra-fancy restaurant where he wouldn't know which fork to use and the waiters would look at him like he didn't belong. He texted back, "Perfect. Where should I pick you up? Actually, would you mind meeting me there? My mother has been hovering all day and I'd rather avoid the interrogation. Buddy's Pizza on Conant Street, 7:30. Matthew smiled. Buddy's was a Detroit institution, famous for their square pizza and completely unpretentious atmosphere. This was Sophie choosing something real over something impressive, and he appreciated that more than she probably realized. Sophie was already seated in a corner booth when Matthew arrived, and for a moment he almost didn't recognize her. Gone were the designer clothes and perfect styling. Instead, she wore dark jeans, a cream-colored sweater, and minimal makeup. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail and she looked approachable, beautiful, but approachable. "You look nervous," she said with a smile as he slid into the booth across from her. "I am nervous," Matthew admitted honestly. "I don't exactly have a lot of experience dating women who could buy the restaurant we're sitting in." Sophie winced. "Please don't do that. Don't reduce me to my bank account. I chose this place because I wanted us to have a normal evening, not because I'm slumming it for your benefit." Matthew felt his cheeks burn. "You're right. I'm sorry that was defensive," Sophie supplied gently. "I get it. People make assumptions about me all the time too, just different ones." She reached across the table and briefly touched his hand. "Can we start over? Pretend we're just two people who met, I don't know, at a bookstore or something." "A bookstore, huh? What kind of books do you read?" "Mostly engineering journals and business publications," Sophie said with a self-deprecating laugh. "But I have a secret addiction to mystery novels. The more impossible the puzzle, the better. Like a Ferrari that 17 mechanics couldn't fix." "Exactly like that." Sophie's eyes sparkled with genuine interest. "I've been thinking about your diagnosis all day. The harmonic balancer solution. It was brilliant because it was so simple. Everyone else was looking for complex problems. Sometimes the simplest explanation is the right one. My grandfather used to say, when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras." Occam's razor. "Exactly." Matthew found himself relaxing as the conversation flowed naturally. "What about you? What kind of engineering? Mechanical?" "With a focus on automotive systems. I did my senior thesis on hybrid engine efficiency." Sophie paused as the waitress approached to take their order. "2 Buddy's specials and a pitcher of Coke." Matthew nodded, impressed that she had remembered his drink preference from their brief phone conversation earlier. "Hybrid engines," he continued once the waitress left. "That must put you at odds with the classic car restoration business." "Actually, it makes me more passionate about it. Understanding modern efficiency makes me appreciate the raw, uncompromising engineering of vintage cars. They didn't have computer modeling and emissions standards. Everything had to work through pure mechanical brilliance." Matthew leaned forward, genuinely engaged. "That's exactly why I love working on older cars. Every component has a purpose, and you can trace the logic of the design with your hands." "Show me," Sophie said suddenly. "What?" "Show me. Use the salt and pepper shakers, the napkin dispenser. Show me how the harmonic balancer works." Matthew looked around the restaurant, then grinned. This was the kind of challenge he loved. He arranged the condiments on the table, using the salt shaker as the crankshaft, the pepper shaker as the balancer, and sugar packets to represent the timing components. "Okay, so the crankshaft spins like this," he began, rotating the salt shaker, "and the balancer is supposed to absorb the vibrations, keeping everything smooth." For the next 20 minutes, Matthew explained internal combustion engines using restaurant table items, while Sophie asked increasingly sophisticated questions. Other diners occasionally glanced over at their animated discussion, but neither of them noticed. "You're a natural teacher," Sophie said when he finished his impromptu lesson. "Have you ever thought about engineering school?" "Can't afford it," Matthew said simply. "And honestly, I'm not sure I'd want to spend 4 years in classrooms when I could be learning with my hands." "That's actually very smart. Some of my professors had never worked on an actual engine outside of a laboratory." Their pizza arrived, thick, cheesy, and perfect for sharing. As they ate, the conversation shifted to more personal topics. Sophie told him about growing up as the only child of a workaholic single mother, how she had learned to be independent early, because Emma was always traveling for business. "She means well," Sophie said, defending her mother despite everything. "But she sees everything as a problem to be solved with money or influence. The idea that some things, like relationships, have to develop naturally is foreign to her. "What happened to your father?" Matthew asked gently. "He died when I was 8. Car accident." Sophie's voice was matter-of-fact, but Matthew caught the brief flash of old pain in her eyes. "Mom threw herself into work afterward. I think she felt like if she could just build the business big enough, make us secure enough, nothing bad could touch us again. That's a lot of pressure for both of you." "It is. What about your family?" Matthew told her about growing up in a small Mississippi town, how his grandfather had owned the only garage for 50 miles and taught him everything about engines, how his mother had worked 3 jobs to send him to community college, and how he had come to Detroit because the auto industry offered more opportunities than anywhere else. "She's proud of you," Sophie said. "Your mother. I can hear it in the way you talk about her." "She is, but she's also worried that I'm getting in over my head with all this." Matthew gestured vaguely, encompassing their date, the job offer, the entire surreal situation. "Are you getting in over your head?" Matthew studied Sophie's face across the table, the intelligence in her eyes, the genuine warmth in her smile, the way she listened like his words actually mattered to her. "Probably," he said honestly, "but maybe that's not always a bad thing." As they prepared to leave the restaurant, Sophie reached for her wallet, but Matthew gently stopped her. "I asked you out, remember, this is my treat." "Matthew, you don't have to prove anything to me." "I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm trying to be the kind of man who takes care of the woman he's with, regardless of how much money either of us has." Sophie looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Thank you for dinner and for this, for treating me like a normal person. Thank you for being worth treating well." Outside the restaurant, they stood awkwardly by their cars, neither quite ready for the evening to end. "I had a really good time," Sophie said softly. "So did I, better than I expected, honestly." "Honestly?" Sophie laughed. "What were you expecting?" "I don't know, awkward silences, uncomfortable conversations about money, maybe you looking down on where I come from. And instead I found someone who gets excited about mechanical engineering and doesn't mind eating pizza with her hands." Matthew stepped closer. "Someone who asks real questions and gives real answers." "Matthew, I know this is complicated. I know your mother has expectations and timelines and probably a whole plan worked out in her head, but I don't want to date Emma White's daughter. I want to date Sophie." Sophie's breath caught. "What if they turn out to be the same person? Then I guess I'll have to figure out how to handle having a girlfriend who's smarter and more successful than I am." "You think I'm smarter than you are," Matthew laughed. "Sophie, you have an engineering degree from one of the best schools in the country. I learned everything I know from my grandfather and trial and error. You solved a problem in 20 minutes that stumped 17 experts with fancy degrees and expensive diagnostic equipment. Intelligence isn't about where you went to school." Before Matthew could respond, Sophie stepped forward and kissed him softly. It was brief, tentative, but it sent electricity through his entire body. "I want to see you again," she whispered against his lips. "Tomorrow?" Matthew asked hopefully. "Tomorrow I have to deal with my mother's inevitable interrogation about tonight, but Saturday, if you're free." "I'm free," as they drove away in opposite directions. Both Matthew and Sophie felt the same unexpected lightness. What had started as their mother's schemes and bizarre circumstances was becoming something real, something that belonged entirely to them. Neither of them noticed the black sedan that had been parked across the street from the restaurant, or the photographer inside, who had captured every moment of their first kiss. Matthew woke up Saturday morning with a smile on his face for the first time in years. He and Sophie had texted until nearly midnight, sharing stories about their worst first dates and debating the merits of different engine configurations. She was funny, intelligent, and refreshingly honest about everything from her favorite movies to her complicated relationship with her mother's expectations. He was brewing coffee and planning their second date when his phone rang. Tony's name flashed on the screen. "Hey boss, what's up?" "Matt, you need to see today's Detroit news right now." Tony's voice was strained. "Worried? Why, what's wrong?" "Just find a copy, page 3, and Matt, maybe don't leave your apartment for a while." The line went dead, leaving Matthew staring at his phone in confusion. He quickly dressed and walked to the corner store, buying a copy of the Detroit News with growing anxiety. He didn't have to look hard for the story. Page 3 featured a large photograph of him and Sophie kissing outside Buddy's Pizza, under the headline, "White Heiress's Secret Romance with Garage Mechanic." Matthew's blood turned to ice as he read the article. Sophie White, 26, daughter of automotive empire CEO Emma White, was spotted in an intimate moment with Matthew Nguyen, a mechanic from Rodriguez Auto Repair in Detroit's East Side. Sources close to the White family confirmed that the unlikely romance began after Nguyen successfully repaired a vintage Ferrari that had stumped numerous specialists. The article went on to detail his salary, his background, even quotes from anonymous sources speculating about whether this was a publicity stunt or genuine attraction. There were additional photos of Sophie's car pulling up to the restaurant, Matthew walking to his apartment, and what appeared to be surveillance shots of them at Belle Isle Park. His phone started ringing immediately. First reporters, then curious co-workers, then numbers he didn't recognize. Matthew turned off his phone and sat in his kitchen, staring at the newspaper in disbelief. Across town, Sophie was experiencing her own nightmare. She had woken up to find her mother standing in her bedroom doorway, holding an identical copy of the Detroit News. "Explain this," Emma said, her voice dangerously calm. "Mother, you can't just walk into my apartment." "I can, when my daughter is making headlines that could damage our family's reputation." Emma threw the newspaper onto Sophie's bed. "A secret romance, Sophie? You went behind my back?" Sophie grabbed the paper, her stomach dropping as she saw the photograph. "This is horrible. How did they even know where we were?" "Someone clearly tipped them off. The question is whether it was your mechanic friend looking for his 15 minutes of fame. His name is Matthew, and he would never do something like this." Sophie's voice rose in anger. "Wouldn't he? Sophie, you've been sheltered from the kind of people who would exploit our family name for personal gain. This young man sees an opportunity to—" "Stop!" Sophie's voice cut through Emma's tirade like a blade. "Just stop, Mother. Matthew didn't know who we were when he fixed your car. He didn't know about the money or the business or any of it. He accepted your ridiculous challenge because he wanted to solve a mechanical puzzle. And now that he knows exactly what you're worth," Sophie felt doubt creep into her mind. Despite her defense of Matthew, the timing was suspicious. Their first date had been photographed from multiple angles by someone who clearly knew where they would be. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Miss White, Detroit News here. Would you like to comment on your relationship with Mr. Nguyen? We're running a follow-up story tomorrow." Then another. "Sophie, this is Channel 7 News. We'd love to interview you about your romance, very sympathetic angle." And another. "TMZ here. Can you confirm the engagement rumors?" "Engagement rumors?" Sophie showed her mother the phone. "Mother, what did you tell people?" Emma looked uncomfortable for the first time. "I may have mentioned to a few business associates that you were entering a courtship period with someone promising—" "You didn't. I was trying to generate positive interest. The alternative was having people think you were wasting your time with another unsuitable candidate." Sophie stared at her mother in horror. "You leaked this story. I did no such thing. You told your business contacts about Matthew, about the marriage arrangement, about everything, and one of them clearly decided it was newsworthy enough to sell to the press." Emma's silence was answer enough. "How could you?" Sophie's voice broke with betrayal. "How could you do this to us, to him?" "Sophie, darling, I was trying to protect you. If this relationship is going to continue, it's better to control the narrative from the beginning rather than—" "Get out!" Sophie's voice was quiet but firm. "Get out of my apartment now. Sophie, now." Matthew's phone had been buzzing constantly despite being turned off, messages piling up in his voicemail. Finally, he turned it back on and found 17 missed calls from Sophie. Her most recent voicemail made his heart break. "Matthew, it's me. I'm so sorry about the newspaper, I think my mother might have caused this somehow. Please call me back. I need to explain. I need you to know that I had nothing to do with this, please." He was about to call her back when there was a sharp knock at his door. Through the peephole, he saw two men in expensive suits. "Mr. Nguyen, we're with White Industries Security, Mrs. White would like to speak with you." Matthew opened the door, confused. "Security? Mom is in the car. She'd prefer to speak privately." Against his better judgment, Matthew followed them downstairs to where a black Mercedes waited at the curb. Emma White sat in the back seat, her expression unreadable. "Get in, Matthew. We need to talk." Matthew slid into the seat across from her, immediately feeling like he was walking into a trap. "Mrs. White, if this is about the newspaper article—" "It is." Emma studied him with those sharp blue eyes. "Tell me, Matthew, did you contact the press about your relationship with my daughter?" "What? No, of course not. Because if you did, if this is some scheme to extract money from my family through public pressure or embarrassment—" "Lady, I don't want your money," Matthew's patience finally snapped. "I didn't ask for any of this. Your crazy marriage bet, the job offer, the reporters calling my phone every 5 minutes. None of this was my idea." Emma raised an eyebrow at his outburst. Then explain to me how photographers knew exactly where you would be last night. I have no idea. Maybe someone at the restaurant recognized Sophie, maybe... Matthew stopped, a horrible thought occurring to him. Wait, you think I set this up? You think I'm trying to con your daughter? The possibility has occurred to me. Matthew felt something break inside him. Not heartbreak, but the death of a dream he hadn't realized he'd been nurturing. The dream that this could actually work, that someone like Sophie could actually want someone like him. Let me out of the car, he said quietly. Matthew, let me out now. Emma nodded to the driver who pulled over as Matthew opened the door. Emma spoke one more time. The job offer still stands. Regardless of what happens with Sophie, you proved your value professionally. Matthew looked back at her, his expression filled with disappointment and something that might have been pity. Mrs. White, you just destroyed the best thing that's happened to your daughter in years because you can't believe that someone might value her for who she is instead of what she has. He stepped out of the car. Keep your job. I wouldn't work for someone who thinks so little of their own daughter. As the Mercedes pulled away, Matthew realized that Emma White had just made the choice for both of them. There was no way this relationship could survive under the weight of media attention, family suspicion, and the constant question of whether his feelings were genuine. His phone buzzed with another text from Sophie. Please, Matthew, let me explain. This isn't what it looks like. But as he looked around at the reporters who had somehow found his apartment building, the cameras pointed at his windows and the neighbors whispering and pointing. Matthew realized it didn't matter what it looked like. It only mattered what it felt like, and it felt like the end. 3 days passed in a blur of unanswered calls and avoided confrontations. Matthew had taken sick leave from work to avoid the reporters camped outside Rodriguez Auto Repair, while Sophie had locked herself in her apartment. Refusing to see her mother or answer the endless stream of interview requests on Tuesday evening, as Matthew sat in his darkened apartment, wondering how everything had gone so wrong so quickly, there was a soft knock at his door. He looked through the peephole and saw Sophie standing in the hallway wearing a baseball cap pulled low and sunglasses. Despite the fact that it was nearly dark outside, he opened the door and they stared at each other for a long moment. I know you probably don't want to see me, Sophie said quietly, but I need to tell you something important. Matthew stepped aside to let her in, noting the exhaustion in her face, the way her shoulders sagged with defeat. So you look terrible, he said, not unkindly. Thanks, you look pretty rough yourself. Sophie managed a weak smile. Matthew, I found out who leaked our story to the press. Your mother told you. No, my mother still insists she had nothing to do with it, and for once I believe her. Sophie sat down heavily on his couch. It was Charles Whitmore. Who's Charles Whitmore? One of my mother's business partners. Also one of the Harvard MBAs I mentioned, who's been trying to win my attention for the past 2 years. Sophie's voice was bitter. Apparently, he's been having me followed by a private investigator for months. Matthew felt anger rise in his chest. He's been stalking you. Essentially, yes. When his pie saw us together at Belle Isle, then at the restaurant, Charles decided to eliminate the competition by creating a public scandal. Sophie pulled out her phone and showed Matthew a series of text messages. He sent these this morning. Matthew read the messages, his jaw tightening with each word. Sophie, I'm sorry you had to find out about your mechanic this way. I was trying to protect you from being exploited by someone clearly after your money. I have more photos if you need proof of his opportunistic behavior. We can make this go away quietly. Call me when you're ready to date someone from your own world. This son of a... Matthew caught himself. Sorry, this guy has been manipulating your entire relationship from the beginning. It gets worse. Sophie's voice was barely a whisper. I confronted him today, recorded the conversation. She pressed play on her phone. Charles Whitmore's smooth, confident voice filled the small apartment. Sophie, you have to understand. I was protecting you. This and Guy and fellow clearly saw an opportunity when your mother made that ridiculous bet. Men like him, they target wealthy women. Men like him. What exactly do you mean by that, Charles? Come on. Sophie, he's a garage mechanic from the wrong side of Detroit. Different background, different values, different social class. I've done my research on him. Grew up poor, no family money, works with his hands for a living. You think that's coincidence that he suddenly became interested after learning who you are? He didn't know who I was when he fixed the Ferrari. He figured it out quickly enough, didn't he? And then suddenly he's interested in dating you. Sophie, be realistic. What could you possibly have in common with someone like that? Sophie stopped the recording, her hands shaking slightly. There's more, but I think you get the idea. Matthew sat back, processing what he'd just heard. So this whole media circus, the suspicion, the doubt, it was all orchestrated by some rich guy who thinks he owns you. Pretty much. Sophie looked up at him with tears in her eyes. Matthew, I am so sorry. Not just for Charles, but for my mother's suspicions. For the way my world invaded yours without permission. You didn't sign up for any of this. No, I didn't. Matthew was quiet for a long moment. But you didn't either, did you? What do you mean? You didn't ask for some creep to stalk you and manipulate your relationships. You didn't ask for your mother to make that crazy bet or create this whole situation. You're as much a victim of other people's schemes as I am. Sophie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I've been thinking about what you said to my mother, about her not believing that someone could value me for who I am instead of what I have. You were right, Sophie. No, let me finish. I've spent so many years having my relationships analyzed and questioned and manipulated by other people that I started to doubt my own judgment when the newspaper story broke. When my mother started asking those questions, part of me wondered if maybe she was right. Maybe you were too good to be true. Matthew moved closer to her on the couch. And now I realize that the problem was never you. The problem is that I've been surrounded by people who can't imagine that someone might want me for my engineering brain and my terrible taste in pizza toppings and the way I get excited about harmonic balances. Despite everything, Matthew found himself smiling. You do get pretty excited about harmonic balances. It's adorable, right? It's one of the many things I like about you. Matthew reached out and gently touched her hand. Sophie, can I ask you something? Anything. If we could start over, no media attention, no family pressure, no stalker ex-boyfriends orchestrating drama, would you want to try this? Really try it? Sophie looked at him with something that might have been hope. Are you asking hypothetically or are you asking for real? I'm asking for real because I've spent 3 days thinking about this. About you. About what happened between us before everything got complicated. And the truth is, I don't care about the money or the social differences or what other people think. You don't. Sophie, you asked me what I wanted, and I told you I wanted someone who wouldn't be ashamed of my calloused hands. But what I didn't tell you is that I also want someone who challenges me, who makes me think, who gets excited about the same things I do. Matthew squeezed her hand gently. 3 days ago, I thought I'd found that person. Nothing that's happened since has changed that. Sophie's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were different tears. So what do we do about Charles? About the media? About my mother? We deal with them together. As a team. Matthew's voice was firm, confident. But first, we make sure we're doing this for the right reasons. Not because your mother bet your hand in marriage. Not because Charles Whitmore is a manipulative creep. Not because the press is watching, just because we want to. I want to? Sophie said without hesitation. I want to try this, Matthew. Really try it. Even if it means dealing with more headlines and more family drama. Even then. Sophie smiled through her tears. But can we maybe keep our next few dates away from public restaurants? Matthew laughed, feeling lighter than he had in days. I know a great little spot by the river. Very private. Great view of the sunset. And I promise to bring better pizza than Buddy's. You're going to cook for me. I'm going to try not to poison you. There's a difference. As Sophie laughed, Matthew realized that despite everything, the media circus, the family drama, the manipulation and doubt, they had emerged stronger. Not because the obstacles had been easy, but because they had chosen to face them together. Outside, the reporters were probably still waiting. Charles Whitmore was probably plotting his next move. Emma White was probably orchestrating some new scheme. But inside Matthew's small apartment, 2 people who had found something real were finally free to explore it on their own terms. 6 months later, Matthew stood in the pristine garage of White Industries' new classic car restoration division, wiping his hands on a clean shop towel as he surveyed his kingdom. The space was everything he had dreamed of. State-of-the-art equipment, a team of skilled technicians, and a steady stream of automotive masterpieces to restore. But the best part wasn't the Lamborghinis or the vintage Porsches lined up in the bays. The best part was Sophie. Bent over the engine of a 1969 Dodge Charger, her engineering degree finally being put to use in the field she loved most. Hand me the torque wrench, she called out, her voice muffled by the hood. Don't say a word about my hair. Matthew grinned, passing her the tool. Sophie's hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she had grease smudged on her cheek, but she had never looked more beautiful to him. Your hair looks perfect, he said, stealing a quick kiss as she emerged from under the hood. Liar, but I'll take it. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of changes after the truth about Charles Whitmore's manipulation came out. complete with recorded confessions and evidence of the private investigator. The media narrative had shifted dramatically. Instead of gold digger meets heiress, the story became Harvard MBA stalks and harasses successful businesswoman. Charles had quietly resigned from his position and left Detroit entirely. Emma White, to everyone's surprise, had been genuinely mortified when she learned the full extent of Charles's actions. Her apology to Matthew had been stilted but sincere, and she had proven it by not only honoring the job offer, but also giving him complete autonomy over the restoration division. "She's trying," Sophie had explained one evening as they watched the sunset from Matthew's apartment balcony. "In her own controlling, dramatic way, she's trying to accept that I chose you. And how's that working out?" "Well, she only asks about our wedding timeline once a week now instead of daily, so progress." Now, as Matthew watched Sophie work on the charger with the same intensity she brought to everything she cared about, he realized that Emma's timeline questions might soon become relevant. "Sophie," he called out, his voice carefully casual, "can you take a break for a minute? I want to show you something. Can it wait? I'm right in the middle of calibrating the timing chain tension. It really can't wait." Something in his tone made her look up. Matthew was standing by the Ferrari 275 GTB, the same car that had started everything 6 months ago. It had been fully restored and now sat gleaming under the garage lights, a testament to both of their skills. "Remember this?" Matthew asked, running his hand along the Ferrari's perfect curves. "Kind of hard to forget. It changed both of our lives." Sophie walked over to join him, wiping her hands on her coveralls. "Why, did you find another problem with the harmonic balancer?" "No, the balancer's perfect, but I did find something else." Matthew opened the Ferrari's hood and pointed to a small velvet box nestled perfectly in the space where the air filter housing used to be. "Found this right where the original problem was." Sophie stared at the box, her breath catching in her throat. "Matthew, I know this is crazy. I know we've only been together 6 months, and I know your mother probably has opinions about proper courtship timelines." Matthew carefully lifted the box from the engine bay. "But I also know that when you find something that works perfectly, something that fits exactly where it belongs, you don't keep looking for alternatives. Are you proposing to me using car metaphors? I'm proposing to you using the car that brought us together." Matthew opened the box, revealing a simple but elegant diamond ring. "Sophie White, you are the solution to every problem I didn't know I had. You're brilliant, passionate, beautiful, and you get excited about harmonic balances. Will you marry me?" Sophie stared at the ring, then at Matthew, then back at the Ferrari. When she looked up again, her eyes were bright with tears and laughter. "You hid a ring in a Ferrari engine. I hid a ring in the Ferrari engine, the one that started everything. That's either the most romantic thing anyone's ever done for me, or the most ridiculous. Can it be both?" Sophie threw her arms around his neck, covering his face with kisses. Yes, it can be both, and yes, I will marry you, you brilliant, ridiculous man." As Matthew slipped the ring onto her finger, neither of them noticed Emma White standing in the doorway of the garage. Having arrived for her weekly inspection of the restoration division, she watched her daughter kiss the man who had proven everyone wrong, who had seen Sophie's worth from the very beginning. Emma smiled, not her usual calculating business smile, but something genuine and warm. Then she quietly backed away, deciding that her inspection could wait. Some moments were too perfect to interrupt. 1 year later, the wedding of Sophie White and Matthew Nguyen made headlines again. But for all the right reasons, the ceremony was held at the Detroit Institute of Arts, surrounded by their closest friends and family. The reception featured both elegant catering and a Buddy's pizza station. Because Sophie had insisted on including the place where their first real date had happened, Tony Rodriguez served as Matthew's best man, proudly wearing the first suit he'd owned in 20 years. Emma White, resplendent in designer silk, walked Sophie down the aisle with tears in her eyes and genuine happiness in her smile. But the detail that made every newspaper and magazine was the couple's exit from the ceremony. Instead of a traditional limousine or horse-drawn carriage, Matthew and Sophie drove away in the restored 1967 Ferrari 275 GTB, now bearing a small placard on the dashboard that read, "The car that started it all." As they cruised through downtown Detroit in the gleaming red Ferrari, Sophie reached over and took Matthew's hand. "No regrets?" she asked, shouting slightly to be heard over the magnificent roar of the V12 engine. "About marrying you, never." Matthew squeezed her hand. "About your mother's dramatic bet, never. About fixing this particular Ferrari on that particular day, never." Sophie finished with him, laughing, behind them, in a convoy of luxury cars carrying their wedding party. Emma White sat in her Bentley with tears streaming down her cheeks. Her assistant, concerned, offered her a tissue. "Mum, are you all right?" Emma dabbed her eyes, careful not to smudge her makeup. "I'm perfect. Absolutely perfect. Do you know how rare it is to be completely, spectacularly wrong about something and have it turn out to be the best mistake you ever made?" The assistant looked confused, but Emma just smiled and watched the Ferrari disappear around a corner, carrying her daughter toward a future that was infinitely better than anything she could have planned. Sometimes, Emma realized, the best solutions came from the most unexpected places. Sometimes, when you thought you were making a joke, you were actually making a miracle. And sometimes, just sometimes, a 20-minute diagnosis of a broken Ferrari could lead to a lifetime of perfectly calibrated love.